A man spent 47 years building homes for other families, and yet, in his old age, he and his wife found themselves sleeping in a makeshift room behind his own son's garage. Not because they were cruel,
Hi,
not because he failed,
what do you
but
think
because when his hands could
about
no
it?
longer hold a hammer,
You
the people he
seem
had built
so far
everything for
away.
decided he was taking up too much space. And just as he learned how to make himself smaller, a letter arrived from a distant relative no one talked about anymore, about a stone house hidden deep in the mountains and a secret tied to that house that would force his children to return with lawyers instead of love. This is not a story about money. It is a story about dignity, betrayal, and the moment when kindness finally answers back. My name is Susan. I am retired now. For most of my life, women sat across from me in quiet rooms, on ordinary chairs, and told me the things they had never said out loud. I did not change their lives. I did not give them answers. I simply listened, long enough for them to finally hear themselves. And today's story is one of those stories. Before we continue, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Are you at home, in a quiet room, or resting in one of life's in between moments? And how are you feeling today? Please share in the comments what is on your heart. Your words matter here. If stories like this touch you, please subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, I will have a special story waiting for you. And wherever you are, I wish you a peaceful and gentle day. Chapter 1. When a man begins to make himself smaller. Late autumn in Knoxville, Tennessee, has a particular kind of quiet. The leaves don't fall all at once there. They let go slowly, one by one, as if reluctant to admit the season has changed. It was during one of those afternoons, gray, windless, and heavy with unsaid things, that Margaret Lane first sat across from me and told me about her husband. This chapter begins where the last left off, not with anger or accusation, but with the slow realization that something essential had been taken, without a single argument ever being spoken aloud. My name is Susan. I'm 72 years old, and I've been retired for 6 years now. Before that, I spent 38 years working as a community counselor, the kind of job where women sit down across from you, fold their hands in their laps, and eventually tell the truth they've been carrying for decades. I've heard stories of marriages that survived infidelity, children who never came back, and silences that lasted longer than love. But Margaret didn't come to talk about herself. She came to talk about Harold. Margaret Lane was 71 then, a slim white woman with carefully combed gray hair, pulled back into a low twist, the kind that suggested habit rather than vanity. She dressed simply, soft sweaters, sensible shoes, and spoke with the restraint of someone who had learned, over a lifetime, not to take up too much space. Her eyes, however, were alert and watchful, as if she were always measuring the room before deciding how much of herself it could handle. When she spoke of Harold, her voice didn't tremble. It lowered, as though she were afraid of waking something that had already gone to sleep. Harold Lane had been a carpenter for most of his life, working in and around Knoxville since his early 20s. For 47 years, he framed houses, repaired porches, built staircases, and fixed the things other people leaned on without ever thinking about who made them strong in the first place. He was tall once, broad-shouldered, with hands permanently roughened by wood and weather. Margaret described those hands to me. how they used to move with confidence, how they could measure a board by feel alone. He was proud of that skill, though he rarely said so. Men like Harold didn't talk about pride, they demonstrated it. They raised 3 children together in a modest ranch style house on the edge of town. Nothing extravagant, nothing fragile, the kind of place where the walls held the marks of real living, scuffed corners, nail holes from family photos, a back door that never quite shut properly in the summer. Harold worked, Margaret managed the home, and together, they did what they believed good parents were supposed to do. They provided. There were no dramatic sacrifices, no stories meant for admiration, just decades of showing up. When Harold's hands began to fail him, it didn't happen all at once. Arthritis arrived the way it often does, quietly, with stiffness in the mornings and pain that lingered longer each evening. At first, the family treated it like an inconvenience. Just a phase, one of the children said. A transition, another called it. They spoke as though Harold were stepping off a moving sidewalk, rather than losing the one thing that had given him purpose. Harold believed them. Men like him always do. He stopped taking on larger jobs, then stopped taking jobs altogether. Tools were put away carefully, as if he might need them again soon. But the weeks turned into months, and the pain didn't recede. Without the structure of work, Harold's days became quieter. He woke later. He spoke less. Margaret noticed how he hesitated before standing, as though calculating whether the effort was worth the trouble. It was the eldest son who suggested they move in for a while. He was in his mid-40s, solidly built, always dressed in pressed jeans and polo shirts, the uniform of a man who believed he was doing well by comparison. His wife agreed, nodding with practiced concern. "Just until you get back on your feet, Dad," she said, smiling the way people do when they believe they're being generous. The house had room, they said. Plenty of room. What they didn't say, what no one ever says outright, is where older people are meant to go when they are no longer useful. The room turned out to be a converted storage space behind the garage. Technically insulated, technically heated, but only just. In winter, the wind found its way through the gaps in the siding, whispering reminders of how temporary everything had become. Harold and Margaret brought with them only what they could fit into a few boxes. The rest of their lives were left behind in a house they no longer owned, in memories that no longer had a place to land. Margaret told me about the first night there, how Harold sat on the edge of the narrow bed, his shoulders slightly hunched, his hands resting on his knees, like a man waiting for instructions. He didn't complain. He thanked their son. He said it would be fine. That was Harold's way, never to ask for more than he was offered, even when what he was offered was not enough. Over time, Harold learned new habits. He learned to walk more slowly, so no one would feel rushed waiting for him. He learned to keep his voice low, especially during family conversations, so he wouldn't interrupt. He learned to sit near the wall during gatherings, his body angled inward as if trying to make himself smaller. Margaret noticed all of it. She noticed how he waited for permission to speak, how he smiled quickly and looked away, how he apologized when he coughed. The children didn't notice. Or perhaps they did, and chose not to see. The moment Margaret finally understood what had happened came on an ordinary evening. Dinner had been prepared, the table set for everyone in the main house. Voices drifted through the open door, laughter rising and falling. Margaret and Harold stood in the doorway, unsure where to go. There were plates for everyone except them. No one had meant to exclude them, Margaret said later. That was the cruelest part. They had simply been forgotten. She told me this part very softly, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed somewhere beyond my shoulder. I didn't realize we had been left behind, she said, until there wasn't a chair for us at the table. Harold didn't say anything that night. He waited until the noise had died down, until the dishes were cleared. Then he returned to the small room behind the garage and sat quietly, staring at the wall. Margaret sat beside him, her shoulder touching his. Neither of them cried. People who have lived long enough learn that tears don't always come when they should. That was the beginning of Harold's shrinking, not physically, but inwardly. He had spent his life building spaces for others to live in, and now he was learning how to exist in a space no one had thought to build for him. Margaret watched it happen day by day, the way one watches a shoreline erode, slowly, relentlessly, without drama. When Margaret finished telling me all of this, the room was quiet. Outside my office window, the late afternoon light had faded into early evening. She looked at me then, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a kind of tired clarity. She wasn't asking for advice. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was telling the story because it mattered. Because once something like this is named, it can no longer pretend to be accidental. And that, I believe, is where this story truly begins. Chapter 2. The letter that carried a name. No one spoke. Aloud. Early winter settled gently over Knoxville, not with snow, but with a persistent chill that seemed to linger even indoors. This chapter follows directly from the quiet erosion of the Lanes place in their son's household, a time when Harold had learned to make himself smaller, and Margaret had learned to watch that shrinking without knowing how to stop it. Life did not announce its turning points then. It whispered them, and most days sounded exactly like the one before. While Harold remained in the narrow room behind the garage, filling his hours with silence and small, careful movements, Margaret took a part-time position at Oak Ridge Public Library, a modest brick building a few miles away. The library had been there since the late 1950s. Its red bricks faded, its windows slightly warped, its shelves bowed under the weight of books that had been read by generations and forgotten by the last. There were rumors, quiet but persistent, that a real estate firm had made an offer on the land. The city council called it redevelopment. Margaret heard it as a kind of farewell. She worked 3 afternoons a week, shelving returns, mending torn spines with careful strips of tape, and answering questions from patrons who mostly needed conversation more than information. At 71, she moved slowly but with purpose, wearing soft cardigans and low leather shoes, her posture upright in a way that suggested dignity rather than stiffness. The library suited her. It was a place where people spoke softly, where time behaved itself, and where no one hurried her along. It was there, in the quiet hours after school let out, that Isaiah appeared. Isaiah was 11 years old, African American, slight for his age, with closely cropped hair and large, watchful eyes that seemed to take in a room before his feet fully crossed the threshold. He wore the same blue hooded sweatshirt almost every day, the sleeves frayed at the cuffs, and carried a backpack that looked heavier than it needed to be. He did not greet anyone when he came in. He simply nodded once, politely, and made his way to the back corner where the children's shelves stood. Margaret noticed him because he stayed. Not for a few minutes, not until closing time forced him out, but as long as the doors remained open. He read everything: graphic novels, biographies, books meant for children younger than he was, and some clearly meant for adults. He read with a seriousness that came from necessity rather than passion. When Margaret asked gently if he needed help finding something, he shook his head and smiled a small, practiced smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Over time, a routine formed without being discussed. Margaret would set aside a small stack of books she thought he might like: adventure stories, collections of short essays, anything with strong characters who survived difficult circumstances. Isaiah would read them, return them neatly, and then help her straighten chairs or cushion tables before leaving. He never asked why she needed help. She never asked why he lingered. Two people, decades apart in age, each quietly searching for a place where they would not be asked to justify their presence. Margaret did not speak much about Harold at the library. She had learned, after years of marriage, which parts of life could be shared lightly and which ones required careful handling. But on certain afternoons, when the light slanted low through the windows and the building felt especially tired, she caught herself thinking of him sitting alone behind the garage, staring at the wall, measuring his words even when no one was listening. It was on one of those afternoons that the letter arrived. The envelope was heavier than most, cream-colored, with a return address printed neatly in the upper corner: Asheville, North Carolina. The name of the law office was unfamiliar, formal in the way such names often are, and addressed to Harold Lane in a hand that suggested either careful penmanship or a computer font designed to mimic it. Margaret held it for a moment before opening it, her fingers tracing the edge as if testing whether it belonged in her world. She waited until evening to show it to Harold. They sat side by side on the narrow bed, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. Harold adjusted his glasses, his movements deliberate, and read the letter slowly. It informed him, in precise legal language, softened only slightly by courtesy, that he had been named the beneficiary of an estate belonging to Edgar Holloway, a distant relative who had passed away several months earlier. The letter mentioned a property located in the Blue Ridge Mountains, accessible by a narrow road, modest in size and held free of debt. A stone house, old, remote. Harold read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it on the small table beside him. Margaret watched his face, searching for something: excitement, confusion, even disbelief. But what she saw was something closer to caution. He knew better than to expect generosity from life at this stage. Edgar Holloway was not a name spoken often in the Lane family. He was a cousin several times removed, a man who had chosen solitude early and kept it faithfully. Harold had met him exactly twice: once at a family funeral nearly 30 years earlier, and once at a brief reunion where Edgar had stood apart, nodding politely, saying little. He had lived alone on the mountain for decades, according to rumor, and had not been considered part of anyone's immediate circle. The next morning, Margaret mentioned the letter to the children during breakfast. The reaction was immediate and, to her surprise, almost lighthearted. There was laughter, short, incredulous bursts that carried relief more than mockery. Someone shook their head. Someone else made a joke about haunted houses and cold winters. Then came the practical advice, delivered quickly, efficiently, as though the matter were already settled. "Dad, you can't handle a place like that," the eldest son said, not unkindly. "It's too much upkeep." "Just sign it over," his wife added, her tone reassuring, as if suggesting a favor rather than a surrender. "We'll take care of the paperwork. It'll be easier for everyone." Margaret watched their faces as they spoke. She told me later that what struck her most was not cruelty, nor even impatience. It was relief. Relief at the idea that this unexpected complication might be resolved quickly, cleanly, without requiring any long-term adjustment. Relief that nothing truly new would be demanded of them. She glanced at Harold then. He was quiet, his hands folded, his expression neutral. The man who had once decided where walls would stand now waited to be told what to do with a house he had never seen. That evening, Margaret returned to the library with the letter still folded in her coat pocket. Isaiah was there, as usual, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a book open in his lap. When she passed him, he looked up and smiled briefly. She smiled back, feeling, for reasons she could not fully explain, steadied by his presence. Later, as they stacked chairs together, Isaiah asked her a question he had never asked before. "Do you like living where you live?" he said, his voice careful, as if the answer might change something important. Margaret paused. "I used to," she said honestly. Then, after a moment, she added, "I think I still could." He nodded, as if that made sense, and returned to his work. That night, back in the room behind the garage, Margaret unfolded the letter once more and read it again. Asheville, Blue Ridge, a house made of stone, standing quietly among trees that had watched many winters pass. She thought of Edgar Holloway, the man no one talked about, the man who had lived apart and left behind something solid. She did not yet know what the letter would mean, only that it had arrived at a moment when being forgotten had begun to feel permanent, and that sometimes, even late in life, the world places something unexpected in your hands, not as a promise, but as a question. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt that question deserved an answer. Chapter 3. The Whispers. Beneath the cold stone. Early spring reached the Blue Ridge Mountains reluctantly, as though the season itself were unsure whether this place deserved softness yet. This chapter follows directly from the unanswered question left behind by Edgar Holloway's letter, the one Margaret folded and unfolded so many times it had begun to feel warm in her hands. When Harold and Margaret finally arrived at the house, they did not come with hope or expectation. They came the way people do when they have been quiet for too long, prepared for disappointment but unwilling to turn back. The road that led to the property narrowed steadily, shedding pavement for gravel, gravel for packed dirt, until the tires moved more by memory than by direction. Ancient oak trees rose on either side, their branches stretching overhead like tired arms that had been holding up the sky for centuries. The house appeared without announcement, a solid shape of gray stone set back from the clearing, unadorned, patient, and older than anyone who would ever step inside it again. Margaret noticed first how still it was. Not empty, just quiet in the way places become when they have learned not to expect visitors. The wind moved through the trees with a low, steady sound, not a howl, more like a breath released after a long pause. Harold stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders squared out of habit. He did not speak. He was listening. The stone house had no ornamentation. 2 stories, thick walls, a pitched roof darkened by time. The windows were small and evenly spaced, their glass clouded but intact. The front door opened with a sound that was neither a creak nor a groan, but something in between, as if the hinges recognized effort and responded accordingly. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust, wood smoke, and something mineral, cool and grounded. They moved through the rooms slowly, deliberately. The furniture was sparse but well made. Heavy wooden chairs, a long table marked with years of use, shelves lined with books that had been handled often and never discarded. There were no photographs on the walls, no personal mementos in plain sight. Edgar Holloway had lived here as though the house itself were enough company. Night fell early in the mountains. The dark came not as a curtain, but as a gradual dimming, light thinning until it simply stepped aside. They ate a simple meal from what they had brought with them, then settled into the downstairs room near the kitchen. The fire crackled softly, filling the space with warmth that felt earned rather than provided. It was after midnight when Harold heard it. At first, he thought it was the house adjusting to the cold, the way old structures often do. But the sound came again, a subtle hollowness beneath the solid floor, a difference in tone that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who had not spent decades listening to wood speak. He shifted his weight, then pressed his foot gently against the stone tiles near the kitchen table. There it was again. Harold knelt down, his movements careful but instinctive. He ran his palm across the surface, tapping lightly, then pressing harder, listening, not with his ears alone, but with his hands. Margaret watched him, recognizing the expression on his face. This was the look he used to wear when he was solving a problem. Focused, quiet, unhurried. "This floor isn't what it pretends to be," he said softly. They worked together, lifting a section of stone that had been set with intention rather than permanence. Beneath it, a narrow opening revealed steps leading downward, the air rising from below, cooler, older, untouched by recent time. Margaret felt her breath catch, not in fear, but in recognition. Some places hold their secrets the way people do, not out of deception, but out of habit. The underground space was larger than either of them expected, its walls reinforced, its ceiling low but sturdy. There were no piles of gold, no chests spilling coins, no glittering spectacle of sudden wealth. What lay before them was quieter and far more deliberate. Wooden shelves lined the walls, each one carefully labeled. Boxes were stacked neatly, their contents protected from moisture and light. Margaret moved closer, her fingers brushing against the edges of the crates, reading the notes written in Edgar Holloway's precise hand. Old land deeds, yellowed but intact, documenting parcels purchased and held with patience rather than ambition. American paintings from the early 20th century, wrapped in linen and oilcloth, landscapes and portraits rendered with restraint and attention rather than flourish. Ledgers from the 1960s, filled with careful entries, tracking investments made early and left alone. The handwriting consistent, the margins clean. And then there was the journal. Bound in worn brown leather, its surface softened by years of handling, it rested on a small desk near the center of the room. Margaret lifted it with both hands, as though it might resist being moved. The pages were thin but strong, the ink faded but legible. Edgar Holloway's voice emerged not as confession, but as observation. Notes about weather, about markets, about the satisfaction of a well-kept silence. They read in turns, neither rushing, both aware that this was not meant to be consumed quickly. Then Margaret reached a passage that made her stop. She told me later that she had to sit down before continuing, that her knees felt suddenly unreliable. The entry was dated June 1985, written without emphasis, as though the moment it described had been small. Family gathering this afternoon, Edgar had written. Laughter at my expense, jokes about my clothes, my work, my decision to live alone. I did not object. I never do. But one woman did. Margaret's voice broke when she repeated the next line to me. She said I was not ridiculous, Edgar wrote. She said choosing a quiet life was not a failure. She said no one deserves to be mocked for living within their means. Margaret could not remember the incident. Not clearly. There had been many gatherings, many conversations, many moments when speaking up had felt like the smallest, most natural thing in the world. She had not known it was being recorded, let alone remembered. But Edgar had remembered it for decades. She turned the page, her hands trembling slightly now. The final entry was brief, its handwriting steady, its meaning unmistakable. I leave everything to those who never asked for it, Edgar Holloway had written. They have already given enough. The room felt very still after that. Harold closed the journal carefully, as though returning a voice to rest. Margaret pressed her hand against the desk, grounding herself in the solidity of the space. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Above them, the house remained quiet, the oak trees standing watch, the wind continuing its slow conversation with the night. The discovery did not feel like a reward. It felt like recognition, delayed, unexpected, and deeply unsettling in its accuracy. Margaret told me later that what struck her most was not the value of what they had found, but the intention behind it. Edgar Holloway had seen them, had watched quietly from the edges of gatherings and years, had chosen not wealth or bloodlines, but character measured over time. They replaced the stone, sealed the opening as it had been before, and returned upstairs without ceremony. The fire had burned low. The house settled around them, patient as ever. Nothing had changed yet, but something had been named. And once named, it could no longer be ignored. Chapter 4. When Blood Learns How to Bite. Late spring settled over the mountains with deceptive calm, the kind that makes birds sing louder and skies stretch wider, as if nothing sharp could possibly break through such beauty. This chapter follows directly from the night Harold and Margaret resealed the stone floor and returned upstairs, carrying with them the weight of being seen at last. They slept little after that, not from fear, exactly, but from the quiet knowledge that recognition, once uncovered, rarely remains private for long. Margaret told me the change did not arrive with drama. It arrived with phone calls that rang too early in the morning, voices that spoke too carefully, and questions framed as concern, but edged with calculation. News has a way of traveling faster than truth, especially when money is involved, and somehow, word of the house, the records, the legacy Edgar Holloway left behind, reached ears that had long ago learned how to listen selectively. Within weeks, the children returned. They did not come alone. They came with a lawyer, a man in his mid-40s, with neatly trimmed hair, a charcoal suit that looked expensive without appearing indulgent, and a leather briefcase, carried like an extension of his arm. His voice was calm, his smile practiced, his eyes alert in the way of people trained to spot weakness without acknowledging it. He introduced himself politely, using full names, shaking hands firmly, as though this were a business meeting rather than a reckoning. Papers were laid out on the table, Forms, affidavits, language that sounded almost gentle if one did not know how to read between the lines. The phrase that lingered longest in the air was delivered without emphasis, as though it were merely a technicality. Financial guardianship due to diminished capacity. Harold sat very still as it was read aloud. The man who had spent 47 years measuring twice and cutting once, who had taught his children how to hold a hammer without bruising their thumbs, was now being discussed as though he were a liability rather than a life. His hands rested on the table, steady but pale. His jaw set not in anger, but in something closer to disbelief. Margaret watched his face as the words settled. She recognized the expression immediately. It was the same look she had seen years earlier when doctors explained his joints would not improve, when his body began betraying him in small, cumulative ways. It was the look of a man being told, once again, that his usefulness had expired. They spoke of safety, of protection, of responsibility. The children did not raise their voices. They did not accuse. They framed everything as necessity. Margaret told me later that this was the part that hurt most, not cruelty, but efficiency. As if love could be itemized and reduced to paperwork. Harold was referred to in the third person while sitting at the same table. His past achievements were acknowledged briefly, politely, before being set aside as irrelevant to the present discussion. When he spoke, his words were met with nods that signaled hearing without listening. Someone said gently, "Dad, this is for your own good." That was when Margaret felt something inside her shift. Around the same time, Isaiah disappeared from the library. At first, Margaret assumed he was sick, or visiting family, or simply testing his independence the way children do. But days passed, then a week. His corner remained empty. The chair he favored stayed pushed in, untouched. The small stack of books Margaret had set aside for him gathered dust. She asked around quietly. No one had seen him. No one knew. The absence pressed against her chest in a way she could not explain, a hollow, similar to the one Harold had heard, beneath the stone floor. She tried to tell herself she was imagining connections where none existed, but her body did not believe the lie. The knock came on a night when rain fell hard enough to blur the world into streaks of sound and shadow. Margaret opened the door to find Isaiah standing there, soaked through, trembling. His hood hung heavy with water. His lower lip was split. One eye was already swelling, the skin around it darkening into shades no child should carry. He did not cry. He simply stood there, hands clenched at his sides, as if letting go might cause him to fall apart entirely. "She hit me," he said quietly. "My stepmother. I didn't have anywhere else." Margaret did not ask questions then. She stepped aside and pulled him in, wrapping a towel around his shoulders, guiding him toward warmth with the same instinct she had used for decades, with people whose pain arrived before explanation. Harold rose slowly from his chair, his face hardening as he took in the boy's injuries, the fear carefully controlled but unmistakable in his posture. Isaiah was 11, but in that moment he looked much younger, his thin frame folded inward, his eyes darting as though expecting the walls themselves to reject him. Margaret noticed the way he flinched when thunder cracked, the way he kept his shoes on even indoors, prepared to leave at a moment's notice. These details matter. They always do. Later, after Isaiah had been settled on the couch with dry clothes and a mug of tea he did not drink, Margaret and Harold stood together in the kitchen. Rain beat against the windows. The mountain held its breath. "This is happening everywhere," Margaret said quietly. "To him, to us." Harold nodded, his gaze fixed on the dark glass. He had not spoken much since the meeting with the lawyer. Words seemed to require a kind of permission he had not yet granted himself. It was then that Margaret spoke the sentence she had never said out loud before. "If we don't stand up this time," she said, her voice steady, unyielding, "then we spend the rest of our lives being people other folks take from." I have heard hundreds of women say some version of that sentence. In offices, kitchens, hospital rooms, whispered into phones or spoken aloud for the first time after decades of silence. I have heard it wrapped in anger, resignation, humor, even relief. But I have never heard it without cost. Margaret told me that saying it felt like crossing a line she had drawn herself years earlier without realizing it. On one side was endurance, on the other was refusal. The sentence did not make her brave, it made her honest. And honesty, at that stage of life, can be more dangerous than fear. Harold turned toward her. Then, for the first time since the children arrived with their papers and their careful language, he looked fully present, not diminished, not confused, simply awake. Outside, the rain began to ease, retreating into a mist that clung to the trees. Inside, 3 lives, one old, one older, one just beginning, waited in the quiet aftermath of a truth finally spoken. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been defended yet. But something essential had shifted, and once again, there would be no pretending it had not. Chapter 5. A Letter. Not written for the court. Early summer settled over Buncombe County with a humid patience, the kind that presses gently against the skin and reminds you that time is still moving, whether you are ready for it or not. This chapter follows directly from the night Margaret spoke the sentence that could not be taken back. The night 3 lives waited under one roof while the rain washed the mountain clean. By the time the court date arrived, nothing felt sudden anymore. Everything felt inevitable. The courthouse sat just off the square, a pale stone building with broad steps worn smooth by decades of feet that had climbed them carrying hope, anger, fear, and resignation in equal measure. Margaret remembered thinking, as they walked inside, that justice rarely announces itself with certainty. It usually whispers, if it speaks at all. Harold wore his best jacket, the one he had saved for weddings and funerals, its elbows softened by age. His posture was careful but upright. Margaret walked beside him, her hand close enough to steady him if needed, but not touching. She had learned the importance of that distance. It was the space where dignity lived. The children were already there when they entered the courtroom. They sat together on one side, faces composed, their lawyer leaning in occasionally to murmur something low and reassuring. There was no anger in their expressions, only confidence shaped by expectation. They believed the outcome had already been decided, not by malice, but by process. Margaret recognized that look. She had seen it before, in people who mistook procedure for morality. The judge entered without ceremony, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair, pulled back neatly, her movements economical, her gaze steady. She listened more than she spoke, her eyes traveling slowly across the room, noting not just who was present, but how they held themselves. This mattered more than anyone realized. The arguments were presented as they always are: concern, safety, responsibility, The children's lawyer spoke calmly, outlining Harold's age, his physical limitations, the recent changes in circumstance. He emphasized protection, not control. He spoke as though the petition for guardianship were an act of love, a necessary intervention to preserve what remained. When it was time for Harold and Margaret's counsel to respond, the attorney stood and said very little at first. He asked permission to submit a sealed document into evidence. The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Margaret felt it before she saw it. A tightening in the air, a sense that something long prepared was about to be named. The envelope was thick, its edges worn, the seal unbroken. This letter, the attorney said, was written by Edgar Holloway several years before his death. It was not intended for litigation. It was intended for understanding. He opened it carefully as though the paper itself carried weight. Edgar Holloway had anticipated everything. The letter was written in plain language, precise and unembellished, the way a man writes when he has spent a lifetime choosing his words carefully. He explained why he had not left his estate to other relatives, citing patterns of entitlement, disregard, and conditional affection he had observed over decades. He wrote not with bitterness, but with clarity. He explained why he had chosen Harold and Margaret, not because they were the closest by blood, but because they were the closest by character, because they had lived within their means, because they had given without record, because they had never once asked him for anything. And then he addressed guardianship. "I expect," Edgar wrote, "that when my intentions become known, there will be those who question the capacity of the people I have chosen. I ask the court to understand this. If Thomas and Margaret Lane were capable enough to be exploited, they are capable enough to decide for themselves. Any attempt to remove their autonomy should be viewed not as protection, but as continuation of harm." The courtroom was silent as the letter was read. Margaret watched Harold as the words settled. His hands were still, his breathing even. For the first time since the children had returned with their paperwork and practiced concern, he did not look diminished. He looked anchored. The judge took her time. She reread sections of the letter. She reviewed the filings. She asked a few pointed questions, none of them accusatory, all of them precise. Then she ruled. The petition for financial guardianship was denied in full. The court found no evidence of diminished capacity sufficient to justify removal of Harold's autonomy. Furthermore, given the circumstances, the family was ordered to cover all legal costs incurred in bringing and defending against the petition. The gavel came down once, clean and final. Margaret did not cry then. Neither did Harold. Relief arrived quietly, like something long overdue finally deciding to sit down. Outside the courthouse, the light felt brighter than it had that morning. People moved around them, indifferent to what had just been decided, which seemed right somehow. Life did not pause for justice. It simply absorbed it and went on. That was when the young lawyer approached Margaret. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a loose knot, a navy blazer worn soft at the cuffs, and eyes that carried more history than her age suggested. She introduced herself with a slight hesitation, the way people do when they are about to ask something personal but necessary. "I grew up in transitional housing," she said simply. "I know what it's like when a place that keeps you safe is treated like it doesn't matter." Margaret listened. This was a language she understood. The lawyer gestured toward the steps. the square beyond, the world waiting. I've been following the situation with the Oak Ridge Library, she continued. If you had standing, if you had a say in what happens to that land, would you want to keep it? The question landed gently, but it carried weight. Margaret thought of Isaiah, of empty chairs, of shelves that held more than books. She thought of all the places that had quietly kept people from being turned away. Yes, she said, I would. The lawyer smiled then, not triumphantly, but with something closer to recognition. Then we should talk, she said. Margaret told me later that this was the moment she understood what Edgar Holloway had truly left them. Not money, not protection from conflict, but the right to choose what came next. Harold had not won because of the estate. He had won because for the first time in years, no one else had been allowed to decide who he was. Chapter 6. What Remains. When we stop being taken. From autumn arrived softly that year, the way it often does in the mountains, not as a declaration, but as a gradual loosening. This chapter follows directly from the courthouse steps, from the moment Margaret realized that what Edgar Holloway had left them was not protection from struggle, but permission to choose. By the time the leaves began to turn, the urgency that once governed their days had settled into something steadier, something earned. They sold only part of the estate, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. There were no grand gestures afterward, no sudden appetite for luxury. They did not buy a larger house or trade in their car for something new and shining. Margaret told me later that extravagance would have felt like another form of noise. And after years of being diminished, what they wanted most was quiet that belonged to them. With the proceeds, they established the Holloway Lane Foundation, AECA, modest but deliberate effort aimed at helping older adults who had been subjected to financial abuse, coercion, or silent displacement by their own families. The foundation did not promise miracles. It offered legal guidance, temporary housing support, and, when possible, advocacy. Margaret insisted on that word. Advocacy meant standing beside someone without replacing their voice. Harold found his way back to wood. At first, it was tentative. He began by repairing small things: loose steps, warped doors, the kinds of jobs that let him relearn his hands without demanding too much of them. But muscle memory has a way of waiting patiently. Soon, he was sketching again, slow and careful, building plans that respected both age and dignity. He started constructing small, simple homes for elderly individuals experiencing homelessness, each one designed with wide doorways, sturdy railings, and warmth that did not rely on charity. He worked in the mornings, resting when his joints protested, returning when they allowed. People watched him from a distance at first, unsure how to approach a man who built quietly and asked for nothing in return. Margaret said the change in him was not dramatic. He did not become louder or more assertive. He simply occupied space again. His shoulders settled, his voice steadied. The man who had once been discussed in the third person now introduced himself without apology. Oak Ridge Library was the next thing to change. With legal standing finally secured and the help of the young attorney Margaret had met after the trial, the sale was halted. The building did not remain a library in the traditional sense. It became Edgar House, a community center that honored the idea that safety is not always found in walls, but in continuity. The shelves stayed, so did the reading corners. But the space expanded to include tutoring rooms, legal clinics held twice a month, and quiet areas where people could simply sit without being asked to explain why they were there. Margaret volunteered there 3 afternoons a week, the same schedule she had kept before, except now the building felt awake in a way it never had. Isaiah was there almost every day. The adoption process took time, paperwork layered upon paperwork, but it was handled with care rather than suspicion. Isaiah moved cautiously at first, still half expecting the ground to give way beneath him. He kept his shoes by the door. He flinched at raised voices, even when they were laughter. Margaret understood these things. She did not rush him. Over time, his laughter returned, tentative at first, then fuller. He grew taller, his shoulders less hunched. He helped Harold Sandwood, learning patience before strength. He learned to make tea the way Margaret liked it, never too hot, always with a slice of lemon. One afternoon, without ceremony, he called her Grandma May, as though the word had simply been waiting for the right moment. She answered as if it had always been her name. I met Margaret for the last time that fall. We sat on a bench outside Edgar House, the air crisp, leaves collecting at our feet in colors too brief to be trusted. She wore a light coat, her hair tucked into a scarf, her face relaxed in a way I had not seen before. Harold was inside, talking with someone about a new housing project. Isaiah was somewhere nearby, his voice drifting in and out of our conversation, like music from another room. Margaret did not speak much at first. She had never been one for summarizing her life. But before we parted, she said something and asked me to write it down exactly as she spoke it. Family is not where you are born, she said. It's where you are kept, when you have nothing left to give. I have spent my life listening to women. I have heard stories of loss that reshaped entire decades, and moments of love that arrived too late to change the past, but just in time to save the future. But this story stayed with me differently, perhaps because it was never about triumph. It was about reclamation. Kindness does not disappear. It does not weaken with age. It waits. It settles into the quiet corners of people and places, patient as stone beneath a floor, until someone finally remembers to listen. And when they do, it speaks. This story reminds us that the strongest people are often the quiet ones. They are the ones who endure without applause, who give without keeping score, and who choose kindness even when life gives them no reason to hope for anything in return. Real strength is not found in wealth or control. It lives in those who keep showing up for others, even when they themselves are tired, overlooked, or taken for granted. People like Harold and Margaret do not help because they expect gratitude. They help because it is who they are. And sometimes, life waits many years before it answers that kind of goodness. But when it does, it answers not with riches alone, but with dignity, belonging, and peace. If this story spoke to you, please share it with someone who might need it today. Leave a comment and tell us what you are carrying in your heart right now. Your words may help someone else feel less alone. If you believe in stories that honor resilience, compassion, and quiet courage, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling them together. May God bless you and everyone who is watching. May He protect those who give without asking and comfort those who feel forgotten. If this message touched you, write Amen in the comments.